So we know things feel really tough right now with the rise of Christian nationalism, fascist rhetoric, and all of it seeping into church and politics and daily life. And of course, the connections to high control Catholicism.
Yeah, it can feel relentless, like these movements are dominating the headlines.
That's why we feel that today's conversation with Joan is so important.
Absolutely, because it's not just about naming the problem, but recognizing that people have been organizing, researching, and resisting this for decades.
Exactly. And hearing that history puts what we're living through in perspective. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
And the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Welcome back to Whiplash. I'm Max Kuzma.
And I'm Emma Cieslik.
Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something many people would prefer not to see: the rise of fascist and far-right movements and how they've embedded themselves in Christianity, including the rise of what we call high control Catholicism.
These aren't just fringe groups on the internet. They're reshaping politics, culture, and even faith communities. And the same authoritarian dynamics we've seen in high control Catholicism, purity culture, rigid hierarchies, insider knowledge are being weaponized on a much larger scale.
This conversation will cover fascism, white supremacy, gendered violence, and the way religion is exploited to normalize hate. We're talking about it academically and will include action items, but we want to give you a heads up before you get too deep into the episode.
To help us trace how these movements work and how to resist them, we're joined by Dr. Joan Braune, a philosopher, researcher, and activist who has spent years studying fascist movements up close.
Dr. Joan Braune is a lecturer of philosophy and part-time instructor in the doctoral program in leadership studies at Gonzaga University, focused on the study of fascist and far-right movements and how to counter their influence through ethical research practices, public scholarship, and community activism. This bio is going to be a little longer than usual, but I think it's important to make sure to contextualize Joan's work for our listeners. Since 2017, her research and activism have centered on fascist movements and hate groups in the Pacific Northwest and beyond, working in collaboration with community organizations, educators, faith communities, organized labor, and others to form responses to targeted recruitment and manipulative messaging by far-right agitators. Braune has published 2 books, Understanding and Countering Fascist Movements from Void to Hope, and Erich Fromm's Revolutionary Hope, Towards a Critical Theory of the Future, as well as 3 co-edited volumes, including a forthcoming book on Christian nationalism. She has also served on the International Council of Experts for the Gonzaga Center for the Study of Hate and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Hate Studies. Some of her public talks and writing, aimed at broader audiences, are available on academia.edu and her blog. Joan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So getting started, as Max mentioned, you are academically trained as a philosopher and did not always study fascist and far-right movements, but began that work in part when you moved to the Pacific Northwest. It was here that people told you to expect vegans and hippies, but what you actually came to discover was that you now lived in an area known for being a stronghold of white supremacists. With that in mind, as well as the results of the 2016 election and Trump's first term, what was your journey like going into the heart of this work? And what was some of your personal background that brought you to this work in the first place?
Yeah, so when I moved up here, I often tell people I did not know anything about Washington State. And so I just thought all of Washington State was Seattle. And I was living in Wisconsin before I moved up here. And people, told me like, oh, you're going to love Washington State. I bet it's just like hippies everywhere and protests and everyone's going to be a leftist activist. And then I got here and I realized there were Nazis, which I had not expected. Eastern Washington and Western Washington are culturally quite different, which is similar to the situation in Oregon, where you've got Portland on the west and then more rural communities on the east. I don't want to smear Spokane though. Like we've actually got like great activism here and like great histories of resistance, great labor organizing. It's a really interesting place culturally and social movement wise. But definitely culturally not Seattle, and very close to North Idaho. And so this whole region of sort of like Eastern Washington, Montana, Eastern Oregon, Idaho, Montana, parts of Wyoming, like there was a whole movement here starting in the 1980s, late 70s to move white supremacists into this region. They saw it as a very white area, which it is, for historical reasons, including racist policies in Oregon Territory, which was essentially a white nationalist state when it was founded. And you'll hear various terms like the Northwest Territorial Imperative, this attempt to create this white separatist region. And so when I moved up here, it was 2016. I had recently finished my doctoral dissertation and worked a little bit in Wisconsin teaching. And my research was on this guy, Erich Fromm, that you mentioned. And I was looking at his critique of apocalyptic thinking, essentially, right? His critique of, now apocalypse can mean a lot of different things, right? It can be like revelation, it can mean hope, etc. But a critique of the idea that politically what we need is this dramatic resetting of history, that things need to be destroyed and reset. And so I was critiquing that idea in my doctoral work. And then when I got here in 2016, it was shortly before the Trump election. And what I realized shortly after the election was that Steve Bannon's ideology was, for clear ideological reasons, very similar to what Erich Fromm had been critiquing, including the fascist historical roots of the ideology that Fromm was worried about. So I started giving talks around the region about Steve Bannon, his influence in the Trump administration, why I thought this was problematic. And in the process, I met people who had done decades of organizing against white supremacist groups in the region, including people who had been at the forefront of resistance against the Aryan Nations compound in North Idaho, which was successfully shut down some years before I got here. So I ended up kind of on the ground floor of activism against white nationalist groups in the area at the same time that this was becoming my academic research. And so for the past 8 or 9 years, I've been focused on researching fascist movements, thinking about their impact and how we can resist. And I've also been doing a lot of like free consulting, a lot of speaking, talking to communities about how to respond to things they're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. I also now want to ask a question just to establish for listeners what it actually meant for you to study fascism. I know you've talked previously about viewing firsthand sources and materials. And I wanted to ask because, for example, when I think about fascist material, I think of like World War II era propaganda, these very high contrast illustrations with bold text on them. But of course, now we live in a different era and we have different technology. So I wanted to ask what types of materials exist today that you've reviewed, and how mainstream are some of these sources versus harder to find? And probably most importantly, how did you take care of your own mental health while studying some of these materials?
Oof, yeah. There's a lot of material. A lot of it's very public online. I'm particularly studying contemporary movements. So a lot of what I focus on is current. And people are quite blatant about what they believe. You can find a lot on social media. There are various books that are not of very high quality, often self-published. There are also blogs and things of that nature. So I do read some primary sources. I've found that to do the kind of work I do, I don't really need to do any kind of secret digging and uncovering of hidden things. There are people that do great work around that and kind of figure out, who's behind particular organizations and that kind of thing. But really what I want to do is help people understand how fascists operate, what they believe, how to respond. And to do that, you can really just look at what they're saying openly. If you know how to see past the propaganda, right? So you have to look at some of the things they're writing for each other, not just the sort of insincere posturing that they do publicly. But there's quite a bit of material that's fairly easy to find. It is exhausting material. I will just be honest with that. And so when I got into this work as a philosopher, with that training, nobody had told me anything about self-care related to research or anything of that nature, because I think they assume people in philosophy will just go read Immanuel Kant in a room and then write a paper about it. So I had to learn the hard way that in my field as well, we have to be thinking about the toll of the research. So I don't really have easy answers, because I do see that the work I do has contemporary relevance that's very, very scary right now. But I do take walks, I do yoga, I have friends, I take breaks, and just those very basic things to find what works for you to clear your head, if you can, is very important.
100%. And I think what you emphasize more than anything is that to engage meaningfully with this material, especially long term, it requires intentional ways in which we care for ourselves and understand how negotiating and navigating research about contemporary systems can be exhausting. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Thank you.
100%. So our next question is, to understand more about the resurgence of fascism today, you have said that it's important to notice two dimensions of fascism. One is that fascism is a social movement seeking power, and two is that fascism is always already connected to sources of power. This is a helpful and powerful frame for distinguishing fascism from simple criminal phenomena that we could theoretically police out of existence or easily recognize by external markers like facial tattoos or biker gangs. This ties into outcomes from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, where some pushed for normalization, in some ways to blend in more efficiently as a method to shore up greater social power. Can you speak to the importance of accurately identifying and tracing these movements for what they are, as part of the work of resisting the violence they inherently promote, and how so-called squishy power fits into this discussion?
Yes. So the term squishy is a sort of Homeland Security way of speaking about their attempts to get people out of hate groups through sort of social work prevention methods and this sort of thing, which I'm somewhat critical of. I do think there are people who have a certain skill set around prevention, but the use of state power in that endeavor is quite problematic in various ways. We could come back to that. But I think when we think about fascism, the reason why I stress to people that fascism is a social movement seeking power, always already connected to sources of power, is there's a lot of naivete about how we want to address this movement. And there are a lot of things that people hope are easy solutions. People hope that you can defeat it simply with elections. People hope that you can defeat it simply with policing. That's of course fading a bit now that fascism has such a position of power in this country. So I think more and more liberals are realizing that you're not going to get the FBI to arrest the fascists when Kash Patel goes on Nazi podcasts himself. But it's not a solution to a social movement to sort of hope that it's going to engage in criminal activity and that the cops are going to go take care of it for you. Understanding how fascism operates, it's important to realize that it has leaders, it has members, it has media outlets, it has funding, it has international connections, it has politicians that support it. So when you go up against something that may seem like a particular individual sounding off online, or a small organization locally in your town that's harassing people, you have to look at this wider network. And ultimately, that wider network can only be defeated by a social movement against it, by anti-fascist social movements.
100%. Another thing that you've also talked about is how fascism holds to a cyclical vision of history. So, like a perspective that views time and events as a series of repeating patterns rather than a straight linear path toward a specific end. I can definitely see how this leads to the mobilization of violence through hierarchical means as well as paramilitary or militias. But I'm curious as well how Christian nationalism plays into this or plays a role here. Specifically, the idea of Christian salvation through the death of Jesus, which I feel like is kind of, that's like a particular narrative arc contrasted maybe with this idea of the cyclical vision of history.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I think when you look at the Abrahamic religions, part of the innovation of Judaism and then of Christianity and Islam is the teleological view of history, that history is going somewhere towards a final kingdom of God, beloved community, messianic age, place of justice and peace, whatever term you want to use. And that kind of hope has motivated lots of social movements. And it was a difference from, say, like ancient Greek or Roman perspectives on history, which is, things are just going to go through this inevitable cycle. It's an eternal cycle that keeps going. Things get better and worse based on sort of who comes to power and how people react. There's a cycle of discontent. There's a cycle of wanting more democracy, wanting more tyranny, and so forth. So the idea was sort of this determinism, this kind of inevitability. You can't do much about it, etc. Now, so when you encounter people on the right, on the far right, and alt-right, who have these views of history that come out of like Rome, it's very interesting to me, like this kind of Roman Empire vision of history. Sometimes you see that meme, something like strong men make good times, then good times make weak men, and then weak men make bad times, then bad times make strong men. It's not Christian, right? It's like an ancient Roman mythology, right? That history inevitably moves in cycles. And it was fascinating to me to see in the early Trump administration the way Steve Bannon was just continually promoting these fascist and fascist adjacent thinkers who were promoting this cyclical vision of history. He's fascinated by it, right? He thinks like there are particular generations that come along that then reset history back to these like natural hierarchies that he believes society should have. So that's not Catholicism, right? But people will fall for that, right? Because he'll say like, oh, I'm a Catholic. I'm just traditional. And in fact, the language of traditional itself in terms of all this is quite complex because you have a whole school of people called the traditionalist school, capital T. And they don't mean going to Latin Mass. It's a community of people, of thinkers over time who believe that they have this superior insider knowledge to what all the world religions or the ones they like really mean. That there's this internal hidden truth in all of these faiths about who should be in power and how history operates. So one of the things about Christian nationalism is there's a real spectrum of theological sincerity. Like we need to be thinking about who is actually saying these things because it's their interpretation of like a genuine like interpretation of their faith. and who is doing a kind of weird pseudo-intellectual trick. Like when I look at people like Peter Thiel, Steve Bannon, some of the people involved in like the tech bro Christian world, and people building these little cities that are going to be Christian nationalist or far-right experiments. Quite a lot of these people don't mean by Christianity what people in the pews mean by Christianity. Like they have this sort of grand narrative about power and, they're thinking about the Crusades and their notion of civilization and so on. That's not to say there aren't people in Christian nationalist circles that are very devout, but not everyone really is a Christian in these movements, right? So that's also something we have to reckon with as we think about how to respond, because you're not necessarily going to be able to defeat that with better theology if it's not theologically grounded in the first place, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on that same line, in thinking about the radicalization process, including the way Christian nationalism feeds into the fascist project, I'm curious to hear some of your perspectives on the way gender roles enter into this. As we had talked previously before, in the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, we've seen, for example, quote, a public performance of grief by his wife, Erica. Writer Jeff Charlotte, through his Substack Scenes from a Slow Civil War, covered Erica's public actions since the death of her husband in an essay that looks at everything from the language she used to the way her hair was done, all to make an argument about how grief is being weaponized. Currently, as we see today with the actions of the Vice President J.D. Vance and current, as you mentioned, layoffs and cultures of upset and predation against federal and secular workers for making comments about Kirk's death. In what ways do you think gender roles impact radicalization pipelines, as well as public displays that work to maintain far-right and fascist power?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think there's so much going on that's difficult to map. Like I've been asked to write about far-right women coming up, and I'm struggling to figure out what is going on there. I think for men or for people from any dominant group, there's a kind of promise that's offered, right, by recruitment into these movements. They're told a story about loss, about why they are not experiencing whatever it is they feel they're lacking in their life. So this is not necessarily poverty. In some cases, it's poverty, and people can blame, the Jews or the immigrants or whoever for someone's, or women in the workforce or whatever the case may be, for someone not experiencing economic success. But it's just also alienation under capitalism, loneliness, people's trauma from living in a society that's very individualistic, very isolating, very confusing, the sense of coming crisis ecologically, economically, war, etc., right? And so people are very destabilized, they're very alienated, and these movements offer them a path to power, or at least a promise of power, and they offer them a sense of an outlet for their anger. Like, we can tell you who's actually to blame for this, and it turns out they're not someone rich and powerful that's hard to get to. They live down your street, and they're, the trans high school teacher or the Black Lives Matter activist or whatever the case may be, right? So there's this redirection of rage, and all kinds of conspiracy theories that get built up around that. Women play leadership roles in these movements too, and I think they have to do a kind of interesting dance, right? They have to kind of pretend they don't want power, pretend they have no influence. They have to tolerate a lot of the discussion being about their physical appearance and their sexuality. But they can wield a lot of influence. They can become influencers, organizers, recruiters. There's a stereotype of women as being, only supporters of men, only bearing children, this kind of thing in these movements, but they definitely are active. And there's no really easy answer, I think, to why someone who's from some identity that's denigrated by a movement would still join that movement. But there's a lot going on there, and there's a payoff. I think if someone already feels like they're kind of worthless in some ways, but the movement offers them someone lower down on the hierarchy to go after, I suppose that gives you a sense of power in spite of your position.
I completely agree, Joan. And as you were saying this, it reminded me of in the 1970s, 1980s, Phyllis Schlafly, specifically someone who mobilized and took on this level of power to lobby for kind of defeating the Equal Rights Amendment, very much under the condition that in doing so and in mobilizing women, especially women from faith communities, including Catholicism, Protestantism, Mormonism, that they would be protecting a way of life that they were, quote, privileged to. So it aligns a lot with what you're talking about of men feeling privileged to a certain amount of access to women's bodies, to access to power, to wealth. So it reminds me the same of Phyllis Schlafly being someone who was criticized throughout her life for being one of the arguably in one of the best in person profiting from the sows of feminism, as someone who's profiting from the ability to travel independently, lobby for and organize these movements, while at the same time denigrating the very movements that she profits from. In the same way, I'm curious, how is this not only in context with gender and sexuality, but how is this also in context with race and class? So in the Phyllis Schlafly example, the idea that for decades, women had the privilege of being able to work in their home as homemakers, and that being an essential part of who they were and how they identify, being something that doesn't exist for many women of color because they worked outside of the home. How is class and race also a part of this high control fascism space, and also performance of those fascist roles in society?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to class, it's interesting because there's still a class hierarchy within the movement. And there's sort of different levels to what people are tasked with, right? So people from, there's a sort of, people call it like suit and tie fascism, right? Like Richard Spencer, who, came out of a history of ancestors being slaveholders, projected this image in the first Trump administration of the alt-right as like very clean-cut, suit and tie, think tank figure. And then you've got people that are, more street brawlers, right, that are going to go out there and punch people in the face. Not that those two categories do not overlap, right? And people, we should not be fooled by people being in suits and ties and going to think tank meetings and assume they won't punch us, because they will too. But yes. But there's a sort of hierarchy of tasks, I think, that people may be given. With regard to race, I mean, race is really at the core of this entire thing, right? And I think in America, fascism would not be possible were it not for our long history and ongoing struggle around white supremacy. So fascism believes in a hierarchy, that there are people who are better than others, that there are people who are, because they are better naturally, more worthy of power, and that society will be better if those people are in power. And that's deeply ingrained in American consciousness in ways that, as white people, we're not always fully aware of. It can show up in different kinds of ways, right? So, like, it's not always just the most outright forms of this, although that's becoming just so normalized. It's also things like, what are people's, if we're talking about Christian nationalism, not just people that are consciously identifying as fascists, because not all Christian nationalists do, what kind of homeschooling materials or classroom materials have these people gotten, right? Like we think about Doug Wilson in North Idaho, who is taking over, his church is taking over the town of Moscow, Idaho, which is a college town. They're buying up all of the land. They've created their own private college. They've got all their homeschooling curriculum they send all over the country. Pete Hegseth in the Trump administration is part of this denomination. Doug Wilson wrote a book on, how slavery was not that bad and Christianized Black people and this kind of thing. And that kind of content trickles down into the educational materials that kids growing up in these families are exposed to. So they're going to school, filling out worksheets about imagining that slavery was not that violent and all of this mythology that's clearly false if you actually study the history of slavery and the Civil War and so on. So there are levels to this, right? But it's so deeply ingrained in our society that when we see these movements emerging, we have to ask, what makes this possible? What makes this possible as what one philosopher calls a live option, right? There are some things that I don't think of as live options in my life, and there are some that I do. Like getting a tattoo, I've never done it, but I could see myself getting a tattoo, right? I could see myself shifting between a number of different careers, religions, ways of life. I just can't picture being Hindu, for example. I'm not saying and feelings of positivity or negativity toward Hinduism. I'm not Indian. I can't picture it, right? So if fascism is just on the table as a live option for Americans, this is a political ideology you can pick. This is part of who we are. This is part of the spectrum of beliefs that we have. Then we have to ask some questions about what kind of supremacy is present in our society that makes that appear normal or feasible to anyone.
Absolutely.
Oh, we said the same. I wanted to ask, in our work, Emma and I's work, where we have a series we've done on High Control Catholicism, we definitely have observed the idea of insider knowledge, or we have the real Catholicism and everybody else doesn't. And we even, of course, see this within parts of the church that are all supposed to still be Catholic, but you'll have these very dichotomous things, like the charismatics versus the Latin mass people, and both sides are we've got the real one. The real one is praise and worship. No, the real one is Latin and lace and incense. So it's just kind of funny. But so for example, connected to, as you mentioned, Steve Bannon repeating and returning to the cyclical vision of history as insider knowledge, right? And I can see also the role of gender roles, as we talked about, because within this idea that history is always moving through these cycles, people are required to play specific roles, which also feeds into the hierarchy. You got to have the guy in charge who's ordering all the foot soldiers as to what to do.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to be a bit more specific about Catholic traditions within Christian mobilization taking place, and tied into the live option you just mentioned, where we increasingly see evangelicals converting to Catholicism, like J.D. Vance. What are some ways that Catholics specifically have been mobilized within fascist movements, or indeed have been, instrumental in starting or perpetrating them?
Yes. There's a lot going on. I think one of the contexts around all of this is the way that the alt-right split in the first Trump administration. And after the Charlottesville Unite the Right march, with the tiki torches, brutal event in 2017, Heather Heyer was killed. A lot of people were beaten up by these white supremacists. There was a split within the alt-right, and part of the alt-right went in a more openly violent, genocidal, and separatist direction, joining movements that may have called themselves accelerationist in some cases, basically promoting mass shootings and things like that. And we see continuing impact of that, where people who maybe have not directly been part of those movements themselves, but have received a lot of that propaganda online and marinated in that propaganda in those spaces, are going out and doing shootings. But perhaps even scarier, I would say scarier, is the way that these people have entered into politics and shaped policy, because the other branch of that movement cleaned up and decided to do entryism. So everything from, running for your precinct committee officer positions in the Republican Party, showing up and getting involved in mainstream organizations, charities, and hobby groups and farmers markets, right? Like wherever you can sort of appear normal to people and recruit people, and getting involved in student organizations like Turning Point USA, College Republicans, right? So you had an entry of fascism into mainstream institutions. And there was also an entry of fascism into the churches. And this is not to say that there's not already like a presence of these movements there organically. But there also was a tactical move where people started identifying as, I'm just more traditional. I'm just more conservative. I'm just what a Christian used to be, right? And so they enter into the churches and then organize for fascism within the churches. And so some of those people, I would say, are not sincere. Some of them are sincere to various levels. It's complicated. And we don't have to necessarily know what someone's level of piety is to know how to fight the movement. But it's just important, I think, to be aware of like what's going on with that and like the spectrum of sincerity that exists there. So someone like Nick Fuentes, for example, who was started out in the alt-right at Charlottesville, had a podcast. He's become a rising star in the white nationalist movement. And he's online constantly, hosting these little discussions where he rants about various groups of people in bigoted ways. His group, which is called America First, or the Groypers, for a while they were actually targeting Charlie Kirk's group and trying to push it to embrace anti-Semitism openly. So they would show up at Charlie Kirk's events and have a question ready at the mic, or hold an alternative event afterwards and try to get people to come and join them. And they also, some of them joined Charlie Kirk's group, right, and tried to get Turning Point USA to embrace fascism from within. Not, again, that there's like a really wide divide between those two ideologies to begin with, right? It was a fertile ground, let's say, for that kind of organizing. So Fuentes, likes to talk a lot about how he's Catholic and traditional and so on. But I think that's more of a cultural marker, like people that have been in his circle. Like there was one guy who lived with him for 2 years, and he says, I think he went to mass once in those 2 years, right? So you have people that will show up at events and they're holding a rosary or they're waving a crucifix. That doesn't mean they even go to church, right? So it can be a kind of cultural marker. Yeah, so I think that's one dimension of it. But then you also have, sort of right-wing, far-right politics that's been within Catholicism for a long time in various forms, that goes back all the way to resistance to the French Revolution and democracy. And that's always been there, and it's being revitalized, I think, in new ways right now. I remember when I was in grad school, the first time I heard about people wanting a king that are Catholic, I just thought it was sort of like a cute, quirky thing. Like, you must be into Lord of the Rings. Like, you probably want to like, what else do you believe in? Elves? It just, it seemed so anachronistic, right? But now we're in a world where we are in, we have a presidential administration that's very highly focused, whether we look at the Project 2025 documents or the people in the administration influenced by the ideology of the Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt. He is surrounded by ideologues who believe that you have to consolidate executive power, declare a state of emergency, and place the executive outside of all checks and balances and above the law, that you should be not subject to the law, but above the law, which interestingly, by the way, just an aside, runs counter to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the most influential philosophers on law in Catholic history, who thinks even God is subject to law, right? That even God is obedient to law, right? So this idea of a ruler who is not subject to law I think there's a tension there with Catholicism, but clearly the resistance to democracy that's been present for so long is like having a moment of hope for their success, and really planning day in and day out in a way that we need to be counter planning against, to create this king, right? To create someone who can be above the law.
Absolutely. And I also want to affirm is what you're saying is important, because there is an understanding that this normalization of fascism as an option that someone can investigate and invest in politically is a new phenomenon. So I think it's incredibly important that you highlight, and it's something that Max and I have talked about specifically social purity movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that reinforce this idea of purity on the basis of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, class, as a way to exert and police who could reproduce, who could hold power within social systems, but also what the right kind or the best American kind of person would look like. Or who should be supported by an American system. With that being said, I'm really curious, and I like how you talk about how fascism, specifically Catholic fascism, is rooted in ideas of purity and performance. How are purity tests and religious ascetics reinforcing the idea that this is a right way to be Catholic? And how is this a historical phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot there. I think with regard to aesthetics, there's just a lot of use of symbol, right? So we see a lot of, far-right people showing up to protest with crosses, with rosaries. And among the non-Catholic Christian nationalists, appeal to heaven flags are a big thing, Christian flags. There's just a lot of symbolism. If you look at what happened at January 6th, at the coup attempt, one of the reasons there's been this regrowth of research on Christian nationalism is just how laden with Christian symbolism that event was, down to, even a priest who was later disciplined for doing an exorcism on the Capitol building, right? And again, that aesthetics can be connected to theology and liturgy, and also can be disconnected from it. So that's kind of a complicated relationship. I think we want to be careful about assuming, too, when we see those symbols within the context of Catholic practice, of allowing fascists to claim those as markers of fascism. So, for example, like when I was in grad school, well before Trump was in office, I went to the Newman Center, which was the Catholic Student Center next to the State University I attended. That was my parish. And we had a new conservative bishop come in. We were one of those parishes that people would see as having all the markers of probably not being the liturgical markers that people would point at and say, well, you're probably not doing Catholicism right. And I bet you have you just pick and choose your beliefs, right? So we had puppets and dance and all of those kinds of things that a certain kind of traditional Catholic would make fun of.
The felt banners.
Oh, yeah, all of that. So we had this new conservative bishop that came in and decided to clean up the Newman Center, right? So he sent in these missionaries from Focus, which is a Catholic missionary group. And these are young people who have graduated from all of those Catholic universities that, unlike Gonzaga, which is Jesuit, there's a particular subset of Catholic universities in America, as some of your listeners will know, and as you know, that see themselves as the real Catholic universities, or more Catholic than you, right? So they were graduates of those kinds of schools, like Steubenville, Ave Maria, and so forth. And they were sent in to sort of clean up the Newman Center. And they started doing all of these very trad kinds of things, right? They organized adoration every morning. There was a lot of genuflecting all of a sudden. There were more rosaries around. It was starting to feel more like the Latin Mass, or more like these sort of traditional practices. There was started to be more Latin in the Mass. And what happened was, because you've got these centers, when you think about a Newman Center, you've got a campus there, right? So it tends to be a progressive student culture. You've got progressive faculty around. And there used to be a lot of progressive Catholics that would go there at the time for the more progressive seeming atmosphere and Mass. And they started leaving. And they left quite loudly, right? Like I was asked when I was going to announce that I was leaving. People stopped putting money in the basket. They started announcing the different parishes they would be going to. And, all of that is fair. I think if it were happening now, I would probably be leaving that situation too. I stuck around to kind of see what would happen. And because it was kind of my parish as a student. But what I noticed, the rhetoric of these, this was Vatican II generation people, right, who had been through Vatican II, had been through the experience of you have to say everything in Latin, you have to cover your hair if you're a woman, you have to do all these things. And they experienced Vatican II as a liberation. And the experience of the 1960s social movements, of religious orders changing how they interacted with the world, all of that. So for them, this was horrifying. It was frightening. And there used to be all these kinds of comments I would hear, like, these kids are genuflecting everywhere. Like, why are these kids kneeling all the time? Like, I'm so sick of these kids and their adoration. And I started realizing most of these college students, they're not doing this because they think it's like Republican politics. It's beautiful and elegant to them. It's a way to connect with something transcendent. And there was this growing generational divide, because there was an assumption that was being made by this Vatican II generation of progressive Catholics that all of the college students who were going to the Focus events were doing this because it was like this right-wing agenda. Now, I'm really way overgeneralizing. So if anyone who remembers this event listens to this, I apologize if you feel like I'm smearing you. But that was kind of the vibe for me. That was the feeling. And so I warn people now, because I see young people going to Mass wearing head coverings, young people going to traditional Latin Mass, this kind of thing, who are not part of fascist social movements at all, right? And on the one hand, they may have a certain role to play in resisting this, which would be wonderful if they can step up and do that. On the other hand, we can also really lose some allies if we start making assumptions that these symbols mean participation in these kinds of movements. So that's just a caution I have around this, because I think symbols are so complex in terms of how they can be used.
I think that is so incredibly important, Joan. Emphasizing, as you said, I just want to highlight, as sometimes I've been saying lately, of like to verbally highlight what you said, of focused on not over generalizing things,
yes,
but also focused on the nuance within these conversations of not everyone who is taking on these symbols are people that necessarily align themselves with fascist systems. But in some ways, there is a sense of overlap of people and something that may be connected to the reasons that they're drawn to these traditionalist systems themselves. With that being said, we always like to bring things a little bit closer to a close with some hopeful action of what people can do and the work that you're doing in the community. What does your activism and organizing against far-right movements look like? And how can others become involved in the process? How can we best move people along the spectrum of allies, engaging passive supporters, raising awareness among the neutral, and even prompting questions for conservatives on the sidelines, while not wasting energy on entrenched supporters of fascism and Christian nationalism? I think of no better time than this week to ask this question.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a great model that I've used as well to help people think about where they want to direct their energy. So there's a little image called the spectrum of allies, right? And on any issue, there are people who are 100% on your page that are out there taking action for it. Then you've got people that are passive supporters who kind of think, yeah, you're right, but they're not really going to do anything about it. Then you've got people in the middle who are neutral. Then you have people who oppose you, who are just sort of passively opposing you. At most, they post things on social media about how you're wrong. And then you've got people who are active opponents of your cause, who are out there mobilizing people against you. I think because our society has become so polarized, we often hyperfixate on polarization as being the problem. And we're often told that polarization is fixed by dialogue with the opposite side. And dialogue itself is like a problematic concept, I think, for thinking about this. Because when I think of dialogue, I think, for example, of like interfaith dialogue. In interfaith dialogue, you are not trying to convert each other. You are explicitly not doing that, right? So you're like, I'm Buddhist, I'm Catholic. What do we have in common? Do we both have rituals involving water? Do we both like statues, right? So you're not trying to change each other. But having that sort of hand-holding, not changing each other with fascists is like bad politics, a waste of time, dangerous to you and those around you. And we haven't talked a lot about specific definitions of fascism in this discussion. But so I don't mean, for example, that you can't talk to your Republican relatives, but there are people that are definitely beyond the pale of what you should be spending your time with, just in terms of safety, your sanity, etc. But I think, if we can bring people who are neutral to supportive of us, including ourselves, if we're not involved in any activism, or if we're not doing as much as we would like, and bring them out into involvement with this, I think with involvement in social movements against fascism, that would be a really good use of our energy. And I think everyone's hoping for a magic bullet, and there isn't one. So what's happening is we have a creeping state of exception, or creeping state of emergency, where the Trump administration is just continually picking new groups of people, new cities, new agencies, and declaring them outside of protection and outside of the law and open for targeting. And so there probably won't be a particular day when Trump stands up and on live media, Vance puts a crown on his head and says all the elections are canceled. You can't say what you want anymore. And if you criticize us, you're going to prison immediately. Like, it's probably not going to be that sudden and dramatic. We're going to see an evolution of this process. As this evolves, I know you asked me to offer hope, but I'm not offering hope yet. I'm going to get there in a second. I'm going to try.
You are totally good. Also, it's fair to be realistic and also talk about the time and the space that we're talking about this in.
Right. I think we're in a really crucial moment to take action because, as Tarso Ramos of Political Research Associates put it recently, he said we're in a 12 to 18 month window of action in which many of us can still do public organizing, public protesting. And if we are not using that time effectively, we may lose that ability. And we're going to probably have increasing restrictions on our ability to do that kind of work over the course of that time as it develops. So we are, I'm so sorry, my cat's meowing in the background. So we really need to treat this moment with a sense of urgency. We are in it for a long haul, so completely burning yourself out is a bad idea. But if you can muster up the strength to do something, now is the time. Sometimes I suggest people pick a niche that they feel like they can do a lot of work in, whether it's a neighborhood, an organization, a particular cause they're very knowledgeable about. Rather than running around trying to do everything, you might focus on healthcare or youth or LGBTQ rights or the environment, right? You can pick a kind of focus because there's 1,000 fires and we can't put out all of them. I also think not compromising on your values and commitments is very important. Like, we're not going to get through this by reaching some sort of middle position where we give up half of what we want and the fascists give up half of what they want. They're never going to give up half of what they want, right? So we would just keep moving further and further toward accepting their goals and their regime. And not being willing to throw anyone under the bus is so, so crucial. Not trans people, not homeless people, not Black people, not people with mental illness, not Jews, not Muslims, right? There can't be a group of people that's acceptable to dehumanize. Because if we grant them that is how they move forward with their politics, right? They're looking for the group of people that you're willing to dehumanize. So I think getting involved, I don't have any magic strategy. Go to some demonstrations, go to some meetings. Don't try to restart everything from scratch. There are people in your community doing things. show up, and work from there.
Joan, I just want to affirm that I think that's so important. And more than anything, it's important what you said at the end of there are people doing this work and to recognize the legacies and the organizing that already exists, to get involved with projects that are already begun in that way. But also, I want to point out recognizing levels of privilege. So a person who is straight passing, a person who is cis passing, a person who is white is probably going to have a lot more privilege of being able to show up to these protests without threats of violence.
Yeah.
So know that the privilege that a privilege that we embody as people is necessarily going to affect the ways in which we can organize and mobilize as communities. And we should be using that to our advantage.
Yeah, definitely. There are different, not everyone can still do this publicly. It's never been the case that everyone can publicly, and there are more people now who can't. And they still play a very important role in movements. It's not that public work is more important than behind the scenes work. I just think those of us who can show up publicly really need to now while we still can.
I completely agree. And I'm so sorry, Max. I have one more thing I wanted to add. Joan, I just wanted to say, as someone who works as a museum worker in the museum system within the United States, I appreciated what you said of we can't cede to a middle ground, because often what I've encountered in the workplace is the expectation that if we just give in on this one issue, we'll be able to sustain ourselves. If we're just lenient on this one thing, if we compromise on our philosophies about including this image, including this artist, mentioning this movement, then we'll be acceptable within this administration to do our work as it once was done. But as we've seen, that's not true.
Right.
There's not a way in which we're going to have or gain a level of permissibility in the ways in which we tell history or the ways in which we practice and present ourselves. So I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, I don't think they will not stop until they can remake any agency, institution, museum, etc. An ideologically consistent propaganda machine, right? They don't want a museum that simply doesn't have that one exhibit. They want a museum where you walk in, there's a gold statue of Trump. Their entire narrative is on all the walls around us, right? This is not a time for compromise with these people.
And Joan, more hilarious than anything, here in DC overnight, a golden statue of Donald Trump holding a Bitcoin has emerged on the National Mall.
Oh, God. Are you serious?
I'm not even kidding you. But it's, I believe, meant to be a satirical one of talking about the ways in which there's kind of this idolization and glorification of Bitcoin and exploitative systems that are inherently tied to fascist organizing and power dynamics.
I just wanted to ask a question. My question may feel like it's like slightly unrelated, but I think it is. So within the topic of like what people should do, I also think that something that's relevant from some of your like work that I have consumed is in discussions about the danger of uncritically platforming and consuming stories of former fascists, sometimes just called formers. What do we do when curious people start seeking out like these de-radicalization stories for consumption? Like, rather than doing that, like if someone listens to this and they get curious and they're like former fascist, they type that in and then they start consuming that content. What is like something else? What should they be looking to instead of those types of stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think these stories often feel very heartwarming and they seem very Christian. They're redemption stories, right? And behind the narrative, there's always more to the story. Oftentimes, there's a kind of what I call the compassion narrative that works something like this. It's a story about a neo-Nazi who had some trauma in life, joined a hate group, and then encountered a very nice minority, right? A very nice Jewish person, very nice Black person, very nice gay person, something of that nature. And this person's kindness to them ignited this sense of cognitive dissonance and confusion and shame. And how can this person be so kind to me? And I misunderstood what this group is about. And they changed their views. This is really factually not what happens in almost all of these cases. Usually what happens is people's lives start to really suck. And for various reasons, anti-fascist activism can help with that, right? People start losing their jobs, or they get villainized in the community for the organizing they're doing, the harm they're doing. And so at some point they begin to rethink. They're like, wow, this might not be an environment to raise a family in, or wow, I might go to prison. And it's usually after that rethinking of their situation that they then rethink their experience and rethink their life. But these stories sell. They speak to us in all kinds of different ways. They're presented rather than investigative journalism. They're sort of human interest stories. And so the media is very bad at fact checking and really exploring what these stories are about, because they think it's the same kind of story as like local 6-year-old adopts blind puppy, right? Like they don't realize, this is a complex situation. But that aside, I think when we think about Christian nationalism, it gets a little confusing because, if you're thinking about, there's also a spectrum of like what it means to be a former. And that language of being a former used to really be about people who had been primarily in neo-Nazi groups, or like ISIS. But now people are embracing that language who have just been in sort of believing conspiracy theories online, and people who, some of whom were very hateful, some of whom were not, right? Some of whom were like believed in flat earth and things like that. Some of whom believed in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then some people grew up, right, in Christian cults of various kinds and like abusive authoritarian fundamentalist groups. And so some of them will call themselves formers. So it's getting very complicated. And there's also a huge consumption of like cult trauma videos and these stories. So I want to be careful because I'm talking more about Christian nationalism now. I've been concerned about the role and authority and power given to people who are former hate group members, as experts who can tell us how to stop hate. That does not mean, though, that people who grew up in fundamentalist Christianity should not have a role in social movements or should not be interviewed or something like that, right? So there's a spectrum there. But I think how we stop Christian nationalism and how we stop fascism, we do have to understand the ideology. We do have to understand the movement and how it operates. And we have to understand what activists who've been doing the work for generations have learned. And if you want to stop a social movement, you have to have another social movement. So you have to understand what you can learn from other social movements. So the real experts are the people who've been doing the work for years, not the people who have been on the wrong side and come to their senses. There are some people in that group who can give us helpful information and data, especially when it comes to sort of the Christian right. But we shouldn't be putting those people as, this is who we listen to, these are the experts. And as I get more into the Christian nationalist research as opposed to the anti-fascist research, I've noticed that in both spaces, there's a lot of white people. It's not diverse enough. But in the Christian nationalist, anti-Christian nationalist research space, it's so heavily Christian. And so you've got people from a dominant group who say like, oh, I know Christian theology, so I'm going to be an expert at this. And it's like, okay, but like, if we are not giving power to people who've been harmed by Christianity on the outside of Christianity, then that's also a problem, right? And we have to be able to learn from those who've been at the sharp end of the targeting and of the hate, right? So, it's just complicated, but there's a lot of work to be done there.
Could not have been better said. I think that's so incredibly important. And it ties into the High Control series that we worked on of platforming analytical research and like first primary source research materials in our deep dive analyses alongside the lived experiences of people who were formerly part of those communities. So both being significant and important, and drawing on the idea that sometimes first person narratives and people speaking from what that deconstruction process looked like can be incredibly insightful and also convincing and contemplative for people that are digging into the process, but it can't be the final word in the story. It can only be the beginning or the continuation of a conversation.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. In one of our last questions for our conversation today, can you talk about the issue of forgiveness that can be seen in the stock narrative of the former fascist? Often, as you said, people focus on the idea that a single moment of kindness and compassion is what changed a fascist mind. This connects to the way of viewing the Christian concept of forgiveness, where it is total and complete, a blank slate that even attempts to wipe clean the realities and experiences of the victim or the victims. We have talked about this on a past podcast with Kaya Oakes, highlighting her great book on forgiveness within the Catholic tradition, Not So Sorry. So we wanted to ask you as well, from the perspective of your work and your research, what are the issues with promoting this kind of forgiveness, and what is a better model?
Yeah, I think the primary issue is harm to victims, survivors, and targets of hate and of these movements. What people do personally with their values and their feelings is not really my concern. Some people will feel that their moral and ethical framework is one where they do not offer forgiveness to fascists. And some people will feel that their personal moral framework is that they do that. And I kind of don't care on that level. But what I see happening a lot is people are put up on pedestals, sometimes simply for apologizing. And sometimes people are put up on pedestals because they have genuinely or semi-genuinely, because that's hard to measure in a lot of cases, done the work of changing and trying to make amends. And maybe they've done 10, 20 years of work since leaving a movement to rethink, try to educate people, try to change, etc. But when we make those people into heroes and experts and authorities on the issue, what happens is the people who are most impacted are hurt, silenced, often re-traumatized. So you bring someone into an organization as a speaker, into a college as a speaker, you bring them into your church as a guest speaker. Like, this is a person who is going to tell us how to stop hate, and they used to be a hater. Even if that person has done the work effectively, and I would caution people, there are people on boards of organizations who've been out of hate groups for years who are still really working through their stuff, right? So they're held up as experts in the media, they've published things, and they are still not people I feel are super safe for everyone to be around. So that's an important caution. But there are people who've done the work more than others. But what we're essentially saying is to people who've been harmed by these organizations, who have trauma from what's been done to them, like, your voice doesn't matter in this situation. This person's here to tell us how to do this. If you don't forgive this person, then you're setting the movement back. You're going to make it harder for other people to leave. You're going to prevent other people from stopping being fascists, right? And that is a lot to put on targeted communities, right? Like, people have to be able to voice what their suffering has been. They have a right to their anger. And there's also just a wide array of beliefs. And I think we have such a Christian frame in this country around moral expectations. But in Judaism, for example, you don't get to forgive someone unilaterally by yourself officially who's harmed a whole group. Like, you can't just be like, oh, it's fine, you were a Nazi, when you've gone out there and harmed a whole community of people. You don't have that kind of individual authority. And we see people exercising that kind of individual authority because they think that's just what morality is, right? Like, they just think, well, forgiveness is what's right, and so I'm going to go forgive this person. And they're not accounting for who's been harmed. So I think, shifting the focus from what kind of forgiveness is or isn't owed to, can we have a survivor-centered, victim-centered approach? Can we be focusing on empowering the people who've been harmed? That might get us past, I think, some of the the tangled, like, moral weight that people feel around feeling like they have to forgive in some cases.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also want to highlight that currently one thing that came to mind as you were saying this, and then I'll hand it over to Max for the final question, is that this past Wednesday, Brian Kilmeade said on Fox and Friends that homeless individuals with mental illness should be put to death. And I want to highlight that after the clip that happened this past Wednesday, was filmed this past Wednesday, kind of blew up online on Saturday, Kilmeade basically apologized for what he called an extremely callous remark. And just as you say, apologies in many senses like this are performative, but they also create the expectation that people who have committed wrongs are owed apologies by the people that they have hurt. And that was a critical piece in our conversation with Kaya Oakes previously that I think you really drive home.
Thank you. And that was a very terrifying moment.
It was awful.
When he said that.
It was awful.
And it reflects changes that are happening. It wasn't just a one-off, right? So I think this is one of the categories of people that are being targeted. And that's been going on for a while. That's a whole other rant, but I've also written about how homeless people have been dehumanized by fascist movements and how that's being mainstreamed.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that came up because in my original notes, I had a note about targeting of the unhoused because I think that's really essential. I just didn't find a way to integrate it. So I'm glad it's there here in the conversation so people can find more work of yours on that note. But unfortunately, we are reaching the end of the time we have for this episode. We may have to invite Joan back to get into other details later. But before we do end here, we just wanted to ask you, and thank you once again for joining us. If there's anything else that we didn't cover in this conversation that you would like to leave folks with or to highlight at the end?
Not really. I just want to express my gratitude to both of you, and I really appreciate your podcast and the work you're doing. And I would just encourage people to try to not get frozen by everything that's happening and just try to show up and do something and notice what you can do in the space that you're in. I think hope is something we cultivate through action. It's not just a thing we wait for. We don't have to have evidence that things are going to work out before we start trying to do something to make progress.
So we've covered a lot in this conversation. From the ways fascist movements manipulate faith through Christian nationalism, the importance of organizing, and the dangers of simple forgiveness narratives.
What stood out to me is that none of this is brand new. Communities have been doing the work of resisting for decades, and we can learn from that.
And for us, that connects directly to our work on High Control Catholicism, naming the patterns, tracing how they operate, and refusing to let them go unchallenged.
We want to thank Joan for joining us and for her ongoing work in the field.
And thank you for listening to Whiplash. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a friend and consider supporting the show so that we can keep these conversations going.
We want to thank Joan for joining us and for her ongoing work in the field. Goodbye.